Life in the Middle Ages was hard enough for most people. Poverty, crime, and disease were rampant across Europe, and life was cheap. Men, women, and children could die from something as simple as a bad cough or a small cut that becomes infected. And if they weren't careful, they could just as easily lose their lives because of an outbreak of plague, famine, or war. It was a time when many families had to fight tooth and nail just to survive each day. But imagine if you were one of the unlucky few who lost both parents within a few years of each other. What would happen to you? In the Middle Ages, there were no child protective services and no government agencies to care for abandoned children. If you were an orphan, you had very little chance of surviving the medieval era. There were better odds that you would die young from disease or starvation, become a beggar, or worse yet, become someone's slave. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to learn about the brutal reality of what happened to most orphans during the Middle Ages. Make sure to watch until the end to learn about some of the lucky orphans who managed to make it through alive. Now let's go back to the Middle Ages. For most of history, children have been seen as possessions of their father rather than independent human beings. Even after the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages, around 476 AD, children remained the property of their fathers. The concept of childhood didn't really exist yet, and kids were often treated like tiny adults. They worked alongside their parents in the fields or the shops, and were expected to behave appropriately with decorum. This all changed during the High Middle Ages, roughly between 1000 and 1300 AD. During this time period, children began to be viewed as innocent and weak, requiring care and supervision from adults. Parents started to worry more about raising their children properly and ensuring they grew up into productive members of society. But that still didn't mean that they had much sympathy for those poor kids who got left behind after their parents died. Sadly, throughout the Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon for a child to witness the death of one parent, only to lose the other a few years later. Famine, disease, and war were common occurrences during the medieval era and could wipe out entire villages at once. War was incredibly violent and deadly, even by today's standards, and soldiers would routinely get injured or sick from unsanitary conditions, lack of nutrition, and exposure to the elements. Disease was another major killer throughout the Middle Ages. During the 1300s, bubonic plague swept through Europe, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. That's nearly half of the population. Other diseases such as smallpox, cholera, and the common cough also claimed millions of lives throughout the centuries. Then there was famine. Poor harvests and crop failures were common during the Middle Ages, due to things such as droughts, floods. When food was scarce, people of all ages suffered, and many didn't have enough nutrition to stay healthy. If a child's parents died, their next best option was to be taken in by family members. However, if they had no living relatives, or if their relatives were too poor to take them in, then the unfortunate kids had to fend for themselves. Although there were laws in place to protect orphans from exploitation, they rarely worked. The church or a local monastery often took custody of orphaned children, but they weren't always the most caring authority figures and sometimes mistreated the kids under their care. As a result, some orphans turned to begging in order to survive. Unfortunately, many of these medieval children ended up becoming destitute and homeless. Some people would argue that it was actually better to be taken in by the church or a family member, since many orphans who begged on the streets were killed, mutilated, or kidnapped. Those who weren't killed were usually taken to work as slaves. Many orphans lived far into the Middle Ages without ever knowing the love and care of a parent. Instead, they were exploited and mistreated and simply seen as another nuisance in a poverty-stricken village. In the Middle Ages, there were two main reasons why anyone would become an indentured servant. The first was that they were born into servitude and had no way out. The second was that poor families sent their children out to work in order to make money. Sometimes desperate parents made deals with wealthy landowners, agreeing that their children would work for them for several years until they were considered free. Oftentimes, though, these arrangements never ended, and the children were forced to work as servants for the rest of their lives. A common type of servitude was called binding out, which involved sending an apprentice to work for a master in a particular trade. Most commonly, these trades were blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, or farming. Binding out agreements usually lasted for 7 years, and the apprentice would receive room and board plus a small wage. While working as an apprentice might sound like a great opportunity to learn a new skill and make money, it was often very dangerous and demanding. Children were overworked and underpaid. Also, if the apprentice tried to leave before his contract was finished, he could be put in jail or even put to death. Being an apprentice was probably one of the less cruel forms of servitude. Many orphans ended up as domestic servants working in someone's home. These servants worked long hours, cleaning, cooking, and taking care of the household. It was extremely difficult work, and oftentimes the servants were treated poorly by the family they worked for. Many servants experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological manipulation from their employers. Although most of the jobs available to orphans were menial and dangerous, they were grateful to have any kind of work at all, since it meant they could earn money to survive. Sadly, many orphans who managed to make it through the Middle Ages still lived in extreme poverty. During the Middle Ages, most people were either peasants or nobles. Peasants were the working class of medieval society and were employed by the nobles to work their land. Nobles were the wealthy elite who owned vast amounts of land and enjoyed luxurious lifestyles. Sadly, some orphans ended up as slaves owned by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Slavery in Europe was rare during the Middle Ages, but it did occur, especially in the eastern part of the continent. Most slaves during the Middle Ages were prisoners of war or criminals. However, some people, including orphans, were born into slavery and had no hope of being set free. Medieval slaves didn't have any rights and were considered the property of their owners. They were forced to work long hours for little or no pay and were often beaten or otherwise punished if they didn't complete their tasks to the satisfaction of their masters. While most people prefer not to think about the dark side of history, it is important to learn about what happened to orphans in the Middle Ages, so we can ensure nothing like that ever happens again. Today, there are organizations all over the world that help orphan children get the care and support they need to grow up into happy and healthy adults. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were basically just buildings where monks lived, prayed, and worked. However, they also took care of some other tasks. Sometimes they even ran some hospitals or orphanages. But let's make it clear that this had nothing to do with charity. The church did it because they wanted to save your soul. And in order to get you to heaven, they needed to punish your body. So if you think your life is hard now, back then, it was even harder. The rules in these institutions were extremely harsh. Instead of warm beds and healthy food, there was cold stone floors and stale bread. The children weren't allowed to complain about being hungry, thirsty, or tired. They had to work all day long, and they couldn't even take a break to rest. If they made any mistakes while working, they would be punished severely. There was no such thing as childhood in the eyes of the church. As soon as kids could walk and talk, they were considered adults. And since they were sinners, they had to be punished like any other adult. It was uncommon for young boys to have to carry around heavy sacks full of grain all day. And when they finished their work, they had to do some more. Even during the night, they had to keep an eye on the other patients. If anyone tried to sneak out, the guards would beat them up. Children weren't allowed to eat unless the adults finished first. They also had to sleep while standing in a corner. And if a child fell asleep in the middle of work, he would get the same punishment as a person who tried to sneak. Out in the middle of the night, the guards would put a bucket of water over his head to wake him up. To stop children from stealing food, The supervisors watched them while they ate and made sure that none of them got too much. The food was usually so bad that many children preferred to go hungry rather than eat what was given to them. We've all heard stories about kids who would eat grass and dirt when they had nothing else. This happened because children in these institutions had no other choice. If they didn't eat what was given to them, they would get punished. Also, the portions were so small that it wasn't enough to fill their stomachs, so they started eating whatever they could find. That's how some kids developed a taste for unusual food. If children complained about the food, the staff would reply that they shouldn't be ungrateful. Since they were poor and had nothing, they should appreciate every piece of bread they got. Many times the children went to bed hungry, and sometimes they would wake up in the middle of the night, start stealing food and eat it in their beds. When the staff found out, they would punish everyone equally. It didn't matter if you stole food or not. They would still punish you because you had something to eat, while others didn't. Monks weren't supposed to touch children, but that didn't mean they never did. There were many cases of abuse. Unfortunately, it was always ignored and covered up. Many children had to endure sexual abuse while staying in these institutions, and the worst part is that nobody ever apologized or admitted what they did. The church believed that sending children to these facilities would teach them a lesson. It would make them humble and hardworking people. But the truth is that it did quite the opposite. Most of the kids grew up hating society and God himself. These institutions didn't teach them anything except how to survive. It was pure chaos. After the French Revolution, the church couldn't force people to send their kids there anymore. And that's why most of these places were closed down. Here's one of the scariest things about life in these orphanages. Kids weren't allowed to have any kind of emotions. They weren't allowed to cry, laugh, be angry, or even talk. The only emotion they were allowed to have was obedience. It wasn't uncommon for two kids to become friends while living in those places. They would stick together and try to help each other survive. However, if anyone showed any kind of affection towards another kid, the staff would punish them. This was done to prevent the children from becoming too attached to one another. Why? Because the church believed that nobody should love anyone else more than God himself. If you were lucky enough to make it out alive, you would probably suffer from psychological problems for the rest of your life. Now, let's look at the pictures. Some of these are drawings, others are paintings, and others are photographs. As you can see, the conditions in these institutions were terrible. The children slept in overcrowded rooms, and they didn't have enough food or clothing. They were forced to work long hours, and they weren't allowed to play or have any fun. If they tried to escape, they were caught and beaten. Life in these places was dangerous and scary. One of the most disturbing things about these orphanages is that the staff didn't care about the children as they saw them as nothing more than property. This led to horrific abuse, and many children were killed or seriously injured. The staff didn't even try to hide what they were doing. They believed that they were better than the children and that they could treat them however they wanted. Another disturbing aspect of these institutions is that the children were denied basic human rights. They weren't allowed to speak or make any noise. They were also forced to wear uniforms that identified them as inmates. This helped the staff to dehumanize the children and treat them like animals. Despite the horrible conditions, some children managed to escape from these orphanages. However, they were always caught and returned to the facility. The staff didn't care about the children's safety. They were willing to do anything to keep them inside. Some of these facilities still exist today, but thankfully they don't operate the same way as they did in the past. The staff is more caring and the children are given more freedom. However, there are still some similarities. For example, the children are still required to follow strict rules and they are not allowed to have many personal belongings. They're also not allowed to speak to the staff in a disrespectful manner. Life on the streets. The year is 1485. You are an impoverished young boy living on the streets of London with your two younger siblings. Your mother passed away when you were only 6, leaving you to fend for yourself and care for your brother and sister. With no other family to turn to, you have been sleeping out in the cold, trying to keep warm by huddling together under an old, tattered blanket. Life has been tough, but you are strong now, resourceful, street smart, and able to get by. Your father had worked as a tanner, but the work dried up after he pissed off the local lord, and he lost his job. Then he started drinking heavily and was abusive towards your mother. One night, he beat your mother so badly that she died. He then abandoned her outside, leaving her to die of exposure. This left you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a few possessions that your mother had managed to hide away before she died. With no money, no home, no food, and no one to turn to, you find yourself at the mercy of the world, having to live day to day, hoping that someone will take pity on you and offer you a crust of bread or maybe even a coin. But people just walk by and ignore you. Some give you dirty looks, while others threaten to harm you if you ask them for money. To survive, you have no choice but to steal food from the markets or beg on the streets. Sometimes you find an abandoned baby or a small animal and you are able to sell it to a traveling merchant. Occasionally, you can pickpocket unsuspecting nobles without getting caught. At other times, you steal coal or wood from merchants who don't notice or care. You are not alone in this struggle. In fact, there are many other destitute children who live just like you, surviving by their wits and doing whatever they can to stay alive. They, too, have been abandoned, orphaned, or simply born into poverty. And they, too, are fighting to survive in a world that seems determined to crush them. For most of these children, life on the streets is all they have ever known. They've never had a real home or family, and they've never been able to go to school. For some, it is better this way, because some of these street kids have been abused or mistreated so badly at home that the streets seem like a refuge compared to their own families. Other times, though, it's the opposite. A noble family will take notice of your drive and determination, and they'll offer you a place in their home as a servant. This might sound like a good deal at first, but actually it's not. See, what they're really offering you is a lifetime of servitude. You will basically become a slave to this family, working long hours for little or no pay. If you are desperate enough, you might agree to these terms. However, you should think carefully before making your decision. Because once you sign on as a servant, it will be very difficult to leave. Many children choose to stay on the streets rather than become a servant. They know that life is hard, but they also know that they are free. They can come and go as they please, and they don't have to listen to anyone. Of course, this isn't always true. Sometimes the authorities will round up street children and force them into servitude. They may be taken to a workhouse where they are forced to do menial jobs for long hours, or they may be sold to a family who will use them as servants. Life on the streets is tough, but it's not impossible. Many children who start out as beggars end up becoming successful adults. They may become merchants, artisans, or even nobles. It takes hard work, determination, and a bit of luck, but it can be done. If you are one of the lucky ones, a wealthy merchant may take you in and apprentice you to learn a trade. After years of hard work, you may eventually become a master in your field and be able to earn a good living. However, this is rare. Most street children remain poor and destitute for their entire lives. As you grow older, you'll meet other young beggars, and some of them will become your friends. There will be those who are just as clever as you are and who have learned to survive on the streets just as you have. You will also meet kind people who will give you food or money. And there will be those who will help you find a place to stay for the night. But there will also be those who will try to take advantage of you. There are many dangers that lurk around every corner. Bandits and highwaymen will stop at nothing to get your money. And if you are not careful, you could be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Despite all the danger, you will never forget where you came from. You will always be a street kid at heart, no matter how much money you have or how important you become. There is something about life on the streets that just gets under your skin. It's the freedom, the adventure, the challenge of simply surviving. Life on the streets is tough, but it's not for everyone. If you are not strong, brave, and resourceful, you will not last long. But if you are, then life on the streets can be an exciting and fulfilling adventure. So what will you do? Will you fight to survive on the streets? Or will you accept the offer of servitude from the noble family? It's time to make your choice. 1485 rolls around and you are still living on the streets of London. Now that you're older, you've gotten even tougher and smarter, and you're even more resourceful than before. You've made some good friends too, and you know that you can always count on them to help you out when times get tough. You've seen a lot of things that no child should ever have to see, but you've survived. And that's all that matters. As you get older, you'll meet different people who will offer you different things. Some will want to take advantage of you, but you'll be too smart for them. Others will offer you money or power, but you'll refuse because you know that those things aren't worth the cost. You've seen too many people get corrupted by money and power, and you know that it's not worth the risk. You'll stick to your principles and you'll never sell out. Even when things get tough, you'll never give up. You've come too far to quit now. You're a survivor, and you know that you can make it in this world. All you need is your wits, your courage, and your determination. Years pass and you become an adult. You're still living on the streets, but you're not the same person that you once were. You're tougher, smarter, and more resourceful. You've seen a lot of things that no one should ever have to see, but you've survived, and that's all that matters. You know that life can be tough, but you also know that it doesn't have to be unfair. You've helped other people when they needed it, and they've helped you in return. You know that the world can be a dangerous place, but you also know that it's full of beauty and wonder. As you get older, you'll meet new people who will offer you new opportunities. Some will want to take advantage of you, but you'll be too smart for them. Others will offer you money or power, but you'll refuse because you know that those things aren't worth the cost. You've seen too many people get corrupted by money and power, and you know that it's not worth the risk. You'll stick to your principles, and you'll never sell out. Even when things get tough, you'll never give up. You've come too far to quit now. You're a survivor, and you know that you can make it in this world. All you need is your wits, your courage, and your determination. So, what will you do next? The year is 1520. Time has passed, and now you are a grown man, hardened by years of living on the streets of London. You are now considered a veteran beggar, adept at the art of survival. Despite the hardships you have faced, you are strong and determined. You possess a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, which has helped you to con your way out of many a tight spot. You have learned to fight, too, and you are more than capable of holding your own in a brawl. Over the years, you have amassed a small group of loyal friends. Together, you have formed a sort of gang, looking out for one another and helping each other to survive on the mean streets of London. You have developed a routine over the years, knowing which streets to beg on and which markets to steal from. You are also familiar with the city's many hiding places, where you can stash your wares when you need to run from the law, or just need a place to lay low for a while. The people of London have grown accustomed to your presence, and most simply ignore you. You are a common sight, after all, and they have learned not to take notice of you. However, there are some who still take pity on you, offering you food or coins. These are the people who keep you going, who remind you that there is still good in the world, and that keeps you from giving up. In spite of everything, you still hold on to a shred of hope that one day your luck will change. Perhaps one day you will be able to leave the streets behind you and make something of yourself. Maybe you will become a famous outlaw, feared and respected throughout the land. Or perhaps you will strike it rich and live a life of luxury and ease. Whatever the future holds, you are ready for it. You have faced the worst that life has thrown at you, and you have survived. You are a warrior, a survivor, a veteran beggar. What will you do next? Do you continue begging on the streets, or do you seek a new life? For most people, childhood is the best time of their life. But what if your childhood was spent in chains? What if every day you wake up before sunrise and go to bed after sunset, exhausted and hungry, doing endless chores with no reward except for the occasional piece of bread? Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out what it was like to be a slave in medieval Europe. Between 800 and 1500 AD, Western Europe experienced something called the Renaissance, and later the Age of Discovery. While these terms are associated with amazing scientific, artistic, and cultural developments, they also marked a dark period for many children who were stolen from their parents and sold into servitude. This dark chapter of European history is known as the White Slave Trade. But why were so many children kidnapped and sold? The answer lies in the demand for servants in noble houses across Europe. In those days, most domestic work was done by slaves. They cooked food, cleaned clothes, took care of livestock, gardens, and performed other menial tasks to keep the households running. For the nobles, having a large staff of servants made their lives more comfortable and reflected their social status. It also helped them maintain a culture of subservience among the lower classes, reinforcing a rigid social hierarchy. In fact, there were three main categories of servitude available to young European slaves. The first one involved becoming a kitchen boy, working in the kitchens of a noble's house. The second one involved becoming a maid, serving the mistress of the household. And the third option was to become a stable hand, looking after the horses and other animals kept by the nobility for riding. Racing or war. The work in the kitchens was particularly intense. Kitchen boys had to prepare meals for large banquets, often cooking alongside several other servants to feed dozens of guests. They chopped vegetables, kneaded dough, scoured pots and pans, cleaned up after feasts, and prepared ingredients that would be used in baking. A lot of this preparation was done by hand, which meant that kitchen boys and girls had to spend hours over simple tasks. Moreover, since refrigeration was not available back then, food went bad quickly, meaning that the servants had to work long and irregular hours to keep up with the demand for fresh meals. One wrong move and a chef could find himself or herself out of the kitchen and out of the castle, perhaps even without a head. Depending on who was in charge of the kitchen, there were different levels of severity. Some chefs were reasonable and well-tempered, but some were notoriously quick to anger and would mete out punishment at the drop of a hat. The punishments ranged from verbal abuse to physical beatings, depending on the severity of the offense. Kitchen boys and girls could be punished for being slow or making mistakes. For example, burning dinner might mean extra work. Cleaning the oven by hand, while breaking a valuable dish meant sleeping with an empty stomach. Additionally, kitchen staff were expected to remain silent when performing their duties. Thus, a careless comment or a joke could also result in punishment. All this to say that a typical day in the life of a kitchen boy was exhausting, stressful and dangerous, requiring stamina, skill, and a level of professionalism that belied his or her age. Meanwhile, the life of a maid was equally strenuous. Maids were responsible for dusting furniture, cleaning windows, polishing silverware, mending clothes, preparing baths, and generally keeping the house in order. On top of all that, they also had to take care of the noble children and play the role of nurse. The job required a great deal of physical strength and endurance, because most of the cleaning and preparation was done manually. Forget about vacuum cleaners, carpets had to be cleaned by hand, and silver had to be polished until it gleamed using abrasive substances. Mending clothes also required skill and precision, and a maid who made a mistake could face the wrath of the mistress of the house. Furthermore, the maids had to cater to the whims of the nobles and obey their every command without question. Any sign of insubordination or defiance could result in harsh punishment, including physical abuse, confinement to a small room, or even banishment from the estate. Finally, stable hands were responsible for grooming, feeding, and exercising horses and other livestock. This was important because the animals were not just a source of transportation, but also a symbol of wealth and power for the nobility. Stable hands had to rise early, work late, and endure the elements, while mucking out stalls, cleaning harnesses, and tending to injured animals. Since animal diseases were rampant back then, they were also tasked with identifying symptoms of illness and reporting them to the master or mistress. This was not an easy job because horses were expensive, and an outbreak of disease could devastate a noble's fortune. In addition, stable hands had to handle powerful animals that were capable of great strength and speed, making their job potentially dangerous. Any mistake could result in injury or even death. And as such, stable hands were expected to be strong, quick-witted, and unflappable under pressure. To make matters worse, the hours of a servant were long and inflexible. They had to start work before sunrise and continue through the day, taking only short breaks for a bite to eat. Dinner was served late and everyone had to eat in silence. In the common hall, there was no time for relaxation or leisure, and the servants slept in cramped, dirty dormitories with little or no privacy. Their rooms often shared a single window and had rough stone floors and walls. Sometimes there were rats and insects crawling around the room, adding to the general unpleasantness of the space. Also, the servants rarely had enough blankets to keep warm during the cold winter months. So many resorted to sharing body warmth with others in the room. In some cases, male servants had to sleep in stables with the animals to keep them company and protect them from thieves. Despite the grueling hours and lack of comfort, there were still many children who dreamed of becoming servants in a noble household. Why? Because it was considered a great honor to serve the nobility and have access to better food, higher wages, and a chance to leave their village. Plus, they believed that working for a noble family would offer them a better life, exposing them to new experiences and opportunities that would not have been possible otherwise. Sadly, most of them didn't realize that their new life would be filled with hard work, meager rations, and harsh punishments. Many stories circulated about mistreated and abused servants, yet the allure of a better life kept children hopeful. It should be noted that while slavery was officially abolished in the 14th century, serfdom still existed in parts of Europe. Serfs were tied to the land and had to work for the lord of the manor in exchange for protection and a place to live. Although they were not technically owned by their lords, serfs had very few rights and were expected to follow their master's orders. In conclusion, childhood in medieval Europe was a challenging time for many, especially for those who were sold into servitude. These young individuals had to endure long hours, harsh punishments, and a lack of personal freedom. Despite the difficulties, they played a vital role in maintaining the social order and way of life during this period. By understanding their experiences, we gain a deeper appreciation for the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before us. Before we wrap up today's episode, let me share a quote from the great Nelson Mandela that reads, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. I believe that knowledge is the key to a better future, and I am committed to making history and current events more accessible to everyone. If you share my passion for learning, please consider supporting my work. Your support will help me continue to produce high-quality, educational content that brings history to life." In the annals of history, there have been countless tales of resilience and survival, especially among children who've had to fend for themselves. Some orphans were forced into extremely dangerous or unstable living conditions. Without protection, many were recruited into criminal groups or used for illegal activities. Some were forced to work in difficult jobs far beyond their age or strength. But even in the face of such adversity, these kids showed incredible bravery, determination, and quick thinking. They used every tool at their disposal to try and make sense of the world around them. But this is not just their story, it's also yours. Because if you're watching this video, then you too are an orphan of the digital age. You may not remember much about your biological parents, But they made one very important decision that changed your life forever. They chose to abandon you, leaving you all alone in the cold, dark reality of the internet. If you want to succeed in life, you need to understand the harsh realities that other people are facing. And most importantly, you need to know how to take advantage of every opportunity that comes your way. Here are 25 dangerous things normal orphans have to deal with. Number 1, lack of parental guidance. Life without parents is tough. Many orphans grow up without any sense of belonging or identity, unsure of where they came from or why they were left behind. This lack of guidance can lead to confusion and anger towards the world, making it hard to trust others or form close relationships. Sadly, some turn to crime or risky behavior as a way to cope with their feelings of abandonment. It's a sad reality, but many orphans don't get the chance to experience the love and support of a family, so they're forced to fend for themselves in a world that can be cold and unforgiving. No. 2, living on the streets. Most people think that orphans live in fancy institutions with soft beds and daily hot meals. But the truth is far from that. Many orphans have no choice but to live on the streets. They sleep under bridges, in parks, or in abandoned buildings, exposed to the elements and constantly worried about their next meal. Street life is tough and dangerous for anyone, let alone a child. They're exposed to traffic, violence, and extreme weather conditions. Plus, they have to deal with the constant fear of being arrested or worse, physically harmed. Despite these challenges, many street orphans find ways to make money, whether by begging, stealing, or working odd jobs. It's a desperate situation, but they do what they have to survive. No. 3, stealing food and other essentials. For some orphans, the struggle to get enough to eat is a daily reality. When they don't have access to basic necessities like food and clothing, some orphans turn to stealing to survive. It's a difficult decision that they often make out of desperation, not wanting to admit that they're hungry or cold. Stealing can put them in dangerous situations, exposing them to the risk of getting caught or hurt. In addition to the emotional toll of having to take what they need, many orphans feel guilty or ashamed after stealing. It's a heartbreaking situation that highlights the harsh realities of their lives. No. 4, scamming people. Another way some orphans survive is by scamming people. This could involve begging when they're not actually in need, stealing money or belongings, or even setting up elaborate schemes to trick people out of their valuables. It's a difficult and sometimes dangerous way to survive, but it's a necessary evil for some. While it might seem easy to judge these orphans for their actions, it is important to remember that they reach us trying to survive in a world that has dealt them a harsh hand. No. 5, having to work early. Imagine waking up before dawn, not for school, but for a job. That's the reality for many orphans who have no choice but to work long and grueling hours to help their house or institution stay afloat. These jobs can be anything from cleaning toilets to washing dishes, and they often pay very little or nothing at all. Working at a young age can be dangerous and have long-lasting consequences for an orphan's health and well-being. Not only do they miss out on a normal childhood, but they also put themselves at risk of exploitation and abuse. No. 6, risking their lives. For some orphans, life gets even more dangerous. Some orphans are forced to risk their lives by engaging in activities like stealing, dealing drugs, or even prostitution. It's a heartbreaking reality, but some will do whatever it takes to survive. These activities can expose them to violence, addiction, and other dangerous situations. It's a risky path to walk down, but it's one that some orphans feel they have no choice but to take. Number 7, lack of access to education. Imagine going through life without ever learning to read or write. It might sound crazy, but that's the reality for many orphans who don't have access to education. Without the opportunity to learn, these children are often left in the dark. unable to understand the world around them, or make informed decisions about their future. It's a sad reality, but many orphans are denied the chance to unlock their potential and build a better life for themselves. No. Exposure to violence. Growing up surrounded by violence can have a lasting impact on a child's development. For many orphans, exposure to violence, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual, can lead to feelings of fear, anxiety, and mistrust. It can make it difficult for them to form healthy relationships, and can even lead to behavioral issues and mental health problems. Sadly, many orphans are trapped in a cycle of violence that seems impossible to escape. No. Experiencing discrimination. Discrimination can be a harsh reality for many orphans. Some people believe that orphans are less deserving of love and care than other children, which can lead to exclusion and prejudice. This can make it difficult for orphans to find homes, or even just acceptance from their peers. It's a sad reality, but many orphans face discrimination, and it can have a lasting impact on their lives. Number 10. Being abused. Sadly, some orphans experience abuse at the hands of the very people who are supposed to care for them, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. These experiences can be traumatic and have a lasting impact on an orphan's life. The abuse can come from other children in the orphanage, from staff members, or even from potential adoptive families. It's a dark reality, but one that many orphans have to face. No. 11. Facing neglect. Imagine living in a crowded orphanage with little to no attention from the people in charge. That's the reality for many orphans who face neglect on a daily basis. The staff may be overworked or underpaid, which can lead to a lack of care and attention for the children. This can result in a range of issues for the orphans, from emotional and behavioral problems to physical health concerns. It's a heartbreaking situation that many orphans have to deal with every day. No. 12. Dealing with bureaucracy. Navigating bureaucracy can be a challenge for anyone, but it is especially difficult for orphans who often have to deal with complex legal processes to secure their rights and access essential services. From adoption procedures to inheritance laws, orphans may have to jump through hoops to receive the help they need. This can be frustrating and time-consuming, but it's a reality that many orphans have to face. No. Finding employment can be challenging for anyone, but it is especially difficult for orphans who often lack the necessary skills and connections to secure a job. Many employers may be hesitant to hire an orphan due to their lack of experience or the perception that they are less reliable. This can make it difficult for orphans to escape poverty and build a stable future for themselves. No. 14. Overcoming social stigma. Overcoming social stigma is another significant challenge for orphans. Some people may view orphans as less than others, which can lead to discrimination and prejudice. This can make it difficult for orphans to form relationships and can even affect their access to education and health care. But despite these challenges, many orphans work hard to overcome the stigma and build a positive future for themselves. No. 15. Creating a support system. Creating a support system can be difficult for orphans who often lack the family and friends that most people rely on for help. However, it's possible to build a network of positive relationships with mentors, teachers, and community members who can provide guidance and support. By seeking out these relationships, orphans can create a support system that can help them overcome the challenges they face. No. 16. Building self-esteem can be challenging for orphans who may have experienced neglect or abuse in their past. However, it's essential to develop a positive self-image and believe in their own worth. Through therapy, support groups, and positive role models, orphans can learn to love and accept themselves despite their circumstances. No. 17. Seeking legal counsel. Seeking legal counsel is crucial for protecting the rights and interests of orphans. From guardianship issues to inheritance claims, orphans may need the help of a lawyer to navigate complex legal processes. A good lawyer can ensure that orphans receive the justice and fairness they deserve. No 80. Developing coping mechanisms. Developing coping mechanisms is essential for orphans who face unique challenges and may experience higher levels of stress and trauma. Whether it's through therapy, journaling, or mindfulness, finding healthy ways to manage emotions and stress can help orphans develop resilience and overcome adversity. Number 19. Maintaining relationships. Maintaining relationships is vital for the well-being of orphans, but it can be difficult when they move from foster homes to adoption or when they re-separated from siblings. Staying connected with loved ones through regular visits and communication can help orphans maintain a sense of stability and belonging. No. 20. Setting boundaries. Setting boundaries is essential for orphans who may have difficulty asserting themselves due to past experiences of neglect or abuse. Learning to say no and setting limits in relationships can help orphans protect their own interests and maintain healthy relationships with others. No. 21. Practicing self-care is crucial for the physical and mental health of orphans, who may face higher levels of stress and trauma than other children. Taking time to relax, recharge, and engage in activities that bring joy can help orphans develop a sense of balance and well-being in their lives. Seeking therapy is an important step for orphans who may struggle with emotional and psychological issues. As a result of their experiences, a therapist can provide a safe space for orphans to share their thoughts and feelings and develop healthy coping mechanisms. No. 23. Building financial literacy. Building financial literacy is essential for orphans who often face financial challenges and may lack the guidance of a parent or guardian. Learning about budgeting, saving, and investing can help orphans achieve long-term financial stability and independence. Number 24. Planning for the future. Planning for the future is an important step for orphans who may face uncertainty about their long-term care and support. Setting goals, developing a plan, and seeking guidance from mentors or advisors can help orphans envision a brighter future and work towards achieving it. And now, 25. Spreading awareness. Spreading awareness about the challenges faced by orphans is essential for creating change and improving their lives. Sharing stories, advocating for policies, and supporting organizations that help orphans can make a significant impact and create a better future for these vulnerable children. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values knowledge and understands its power. Keep learning and growing, and you'll see your dreams become a reality. This is The Worst Fate. And now we're back with another installment of the Hilariously Horrible series. So buckle up, you filthy animals. It's about to get real ugly, real fast. A brutal legacy. Being born into a noble family in the Middle Ages wasn't always as wonderful as it sounds. While the rich got to enjoy fancy parties and the finer things in life, they also had to deal with a lot of pressure. See, when your parents are loaded, it's expected that their kids will marry well and continue the bloodline. That meant that medieval noble children often entered into arranged marriages with other nobles, sometimes with disastrous results. Arranged marriages weren't unheard of in the peasant class, but they were far less likely to be made between two people who hated each other's guts. But when it came to the nobility, strategic alliances were everything, and love was definitely not part of the equation. This not only led to unhappy marriages, but also produced a whole bunch of illegitimate children who became known as bastards. Bastards could be the result of a lord having an affair with a servant, or a lady secretly sleeping with someone else. Because of the stigma associated with being born out of wedlock, bastards were often treated as second-class citizens. They might have been denied inheritance or even cast out of their family entirely. In some cases, bastards faced even more horrible fates, such as being put up for sale or abandoned to fend for themselves. An unstable foundation. During the Middle Ages, half of all babies born in Europe didn't make it to the age of 5. As you can imagine, this instability didn't do much for the survivors' mental health. Even if you managed to survive infancy, childhood was still pretty dicey. Kids had to deal with rampant poverty, disease, war, and all the other joys that medieval life had to offer. To make matters worse, medical science was still in its stone age, so there wasn't much adults could do to help. Back then, if you got sick, your best bet was to hope for the best and maybe drink some goat's milk. If you were lucky enough to survive childhood, you might think that your luck had finally turned around. But you'd be wrong, because adolescence brought its own set of unique challenges. Not only did young people have to contend with the same problems as everyone else, but they were also expected to start taking on adult responsibilities. For boys, this often meant leaving home to work as a page, apprentice, or soldier. Girls usually stayed home to help their mother with household duties. However, don't think for a second that this was a walk in the park. Working as a domestic servant in a medieval household was no easy task. On top of the usual chores, girls were also expected to learn how to cook, clean, manage a household, and raise children. They were also judged very harshly if they didn't live up to expectations. So if you thought that being a teenager was hard now, just spare a thought for the kids living in the Dark Ages. Their problems were definitely on a whole other level. No rest for the wicked. Medieval Europe was a dangerous place to be alive, especially if you were a child. At this time, there were countless wars and conflicts happening all over the continent. Just ask any historian and they'll tell you that the Middle Ages was basically one long fratricidal, and when there's war, there are bound to be casualties. And we're not talking about the people who died in battle. We're talking about the kids who lost their parents due to war-related causes like famine or disease. These poor little orphans were then left to fend for themselves, which was no easy feat, considering that they were probably too young to do anything other than cry and beg for food. Many of these children were forced to leave their hometowns in search of safety and wandered for miles, and with nothing but the clothes on their backs. With no one to care for them, many of these kids sadly passed away from hunger or exposure. Those who did survive were often taken in by local communities or charities. But don't think for a second that was a walk in the park either. Living in a medieval orphanage wasn't exactly a picnic. You were probably forced to do menial labor for food and shelter. And if you tried to run away, you'd probably be caught and beaten for being ungrateful. There was a small chance that you would be adopted by a family, but don't hold your breath. Most of the time, these kids ended up working as servants for the rest of their lives. Stolen futures? Back in the Middle Ages, there were all kinds of jobs that needed doing, and not all of them were safe or glamorous. That's why it shouldn't come as a surprise that some desperate parents were willing to do whatever it took to keep their kids out of certain professions. Enter the art of infanticide. Wait, don't click away just yet. We know what you're thinking, but it isn't what you think. Infanticide refers to the practice of killing newborn babies, usually baby girls. And while it does sound disturbing, it's important to remember that this was a common practice during the Middle Ages. Why? Because back then, children were seen as nothing more than property. And if you didn't need them anymore, you could just throw them out. So why were baby girls in particular so often targeted? Well, first of all, having a son was considered more advantageous because he could carry on the family bloodline. Secondly, raising a daughter required more resources, as she would need to be married off eventually. Plus, if you lived in poverty and couldn't afford to feed your kids, it was easier to kill a baby girl than risk her becoming a burden. Some parents even went as far as selling their daughters to child traffickers, who would then force them into dangerous or exploitative situations. One example of this dark practice was the high rate of infanticide in rural areas where poverty was widespread. In these cases, families would often abandon their children in forests or on doorsteps, hoping that someone else would take care of them. Other times, parents would sell their kids to gangs of traveling performers, who would then force them to beg for money. Child's play. Have you ever heard of child labor? Probably not, because it's illegal and inhumane. Yeah, us neither. But unfortunately, this dark practice was all too common during the Middle Ages. Back then, children were seen as nothing more than cheap labor, and were often forced to work in dangerous and unhealthy conditions. The worst part, they were usually paid very little or nothing at all. Children as young as 5 years old were forced to work in mines, factories, and fields, often alongside adults. They were exposed to toxic chemicals and materials, suffered from horrible living conditions, and had little to no access to education. It was a sad reality for many kids growing up in medieval Europe, but it was especially tragic for those who were sold or abandoned by their parents. These children had no choice but to work in order to survive, and many of them ended up suffering from serious health problems or even dying young. Sadly, child labor wasn't just accepted, it was often encouraged. Parents saw their kids as nothing more than assets, and were eager to put them to work as soon as possible. In some cases, fathers even sold their daughters to wealthy families as servants, effectively turning them into slaves. So if you think working a double shift at McDonald's sucks, just remember that at least you're not working in a medieval mine or factory. Key point 6. The fate of war orphans. Wars and conflicts during the Middle Ages left many children without family or support. After battles, some children were displaced and forced to travel long distances in search of safety. Many struggled to find food or shelter and relied on the charity of strangers or local communities. Some were recruited to help with basic labor for armies or nobles. Very few were able to rebuild stable lives. But those who did often had to grow up quickly and take on adult responsibilities at a very young age. Now before you go, don't forget to stay tuned for more horrible historical tales. Also, if you've ever wondered what life was like for children in the Ottoman Empire, then feast your eyes on this video right here. It's time to wrap this up. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay cool. Medieval life was tough for everybody, but if you were an orphan, it was especially so because your parents had no one to look out for you, and in most cases, they would simply leave you out to die. This was the default setting for most of human history. But were there any exceptions? Well, today we're going to tell you about a tiny few who survived. For thousands of years, it was basically impossible to be a successful orphan. In the Middle Ages, you were expected to take care of your aging parents when you got older. That was just what you did. So if they died when you were a kid, well, you were on your own. Occasionally, some rich folks would come across an abandoned child and take pity on them, but this was rare. Most of the time, orphans were raised in workhouses alongside other poor folks. But that was probably worse than being on the streets. The good news is that this situation started to change slowly but surely as time went on. For our first story, let's travel to 12th century France and meet a young man named Thomas Becket. His father was the Archbishop of Canterbury, a powerful position in the church during the Middle Ages. So when he died, Thomas and his brother were taken care of pretty well, all things considered. Their mother remarried and put the boys in the care of their uncle, the Bishop of But, while she took a position as a lady-in-waiting for the Queen. The bishop sent Thomas to live with a family in Rouen, where he received a nice education. Unfortunately, their father also made a bunch of enemies during his life, including the king. And when he was murdered, Thomas's half-brother, King Henry II, blamed Thomas's uncle for not protecting him. So he decided to get rid of both the uncle and the nephew. He sent the latter back to the bishop, claiming that he had done a bad job of raising him. Then he locked Thomas in a tower with 2 servants and left him there to starve. Now, despite his best efforts, Thomas only survived for 18 days. After that, the servants ran out of food and water, and they all died. So while Thomas may have been an orphan in every sense of the word, at least he didn't end up on the streets. Next, Let's travel to 14th century Italy. Like Thomas Becket, our next protagonist also had an important father. His name was Giovanni Boccaccio, and he wrote a famous collection of stories called When he was 8 years old, his father died and his mother immediately married one of his dad's business partners, which made him an unwanted stepson. So she packed him off to Florence to live with his grandmother instead. It seems like she felt guilty about leaving him behind, because she kept him in Florence for the rest of his life and paid for his education. So it wasn't really a sad childhood. Still, he must have had a chip on his shoulder about the whole situation, because several of his works explore the hypocrisy of the upper classes. In fact, the Decameron was written partly as a critique of how the Black Death affected society. During the plague, everyone got a little crazy. People began to turn against each other and commit all sorts of evil deeds. But once the danger passed, everything went back to normal. For the ruling class anyway, Boccaccio said that after the pandemic, people returned to their old habits. The hypocrisy of the wealthy became more apparent. And if you want to hear more about that, check out our video on how the Black Death changed the world. Our next story takes us back to 12th century France and the tale of Agnes de France. She was the illegitimate daughter of Louis VII and an unknown woman. Her father never acknowledged her publicly, but he certainly could have taken care of her. In fact, he sent her a monthly stipend of 100 shillings throughout her life. However, her father was killed when she was only 10 years old, and suddenly her monthly allowance stopped. Luckily, her uncle, Philip Augustus, continued to pay the stipend for her until she was 21. At that point, he tired of her living in Paris and ordered her to move somewhere else. She was forced to sell her possessions in order to make the journey. And when she arrived at her destination, she was only able to buy 1 chicken, 1 goose, and a cat. So now she was completely destitute. Her only option was to marry someone and hopefully get a fresh start. However, she needed permission from the bishop to do this. And after she told him about her meager assets, he said that she should marry a poor man. She agreed, and the happy couple set off for a new life together. She was too busy counting her money to help out around the house. So he went back to the bishop and complained. The bishop then gave her a choice: either find a new husband or enter a monastery. She chose the former and spent the rest of her life moving from place to place and marrying poor men to avoid having to give up her allowance. Sadly, we don't know if any of these marriages made her happy. So far, none of the orphans we've talked about were able to live happy lives. Let's see if we can find one that has a happier ending. For this next story, we'll head across the channel to England and the 14th century. This is the tale of John Somerset. When he was born, his father immediately legitimized him so that he would inherit his lands in Somerset. However, his father died less than a year later, and with no mother to take care of him, John was raised by his uncle, Sir William, and under his guidance, he grew up to be a fine young man. So when the time came, Uncle William helped him get a position as an apprentice under a local tradesman. This is about the best outcome an orphan could have hoped for in the Middle Ages. Even though he was still poor, John had a chance to learn a trade and eventually become a master tradesman himself. He might have even become a knight like his uncle. However, in 1326, Sir William was executed for treason. So John's comfortable life was over before it even began. He went back to Somerset and lived off the land. But at least he had a roof over his head. Unfortunately, it didn't last. In 1346, English peasants revolted due to heavy taxes and bad harvests. John was arrested for supporting the rebellion, and while he managed to escape prison, he had to flee to Normandy to avoid being recaptured. There he died penniless and alone. So sometimes fate just doesn't give you a break, no matter what precautions you've taken. But our final story has a much happier ending. We'll head south to 13th century Spain and meet a girl named Teresa Garcia. She was born in Seville, but when she was 6, her family moved to Lisbon. While we don't know exactly what happened to her parents, we do know that she ended up living with a married couple named Goncalves. It was an all-female household, so it's possible that Teresa was related to the family somehow. Either way, her adoptive mother treated her like a real daughter, and she had a wonderful childhood. As a result, she grew up to be a smart, beautiful young woman, and soon caught the eye of a Portuguese noble named Dinas. They fell in love and ended up getting married. Once she entered the royal court, she became influential and kind of a fashion icon. She used her status to help out the poor and oppressed, and she even founded several hospitals and schools. But she always remembered where she came from and never forgot her humble beginnings. She remained close to her adoptive mother throughout her life, and in fact, she requested that Goncalves de Vasconcelos be buried next to her and her husband when they all died. And now it's time for comic historian's outro. For most medieval orphans, survival was a miracle. If you were lucky enough to survive, your future was still full of hardship. You were destined to live a life of poverty, and your choices were extremely limited. Girls who survived often found themselves married off to men they didn't know at young ages, while boys were lucky to find an apprenticeship. However, on rare occasions, an orphan would rise above their station and live a long and happy life. All it took was a combination of luck, timing, and determination. Anyway, thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe for more. Also, big thanks to our supporters who helped us make this video.